It is now my pleasure to turn the webcast over to Dr. Peter Hurst, Executive Director, MIT Sloan Executive Education. Dr. Hurst, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everybody, and welcome to MIT Sloan School and the next in our Innovation at Work webinar series. We have over 1,100 people, we think, registered for today's webinar. And we're joined here today by Professor Nelson Repenning, who is the School of Management's Distinguished Professor of System Dynamics and Organization Studies here at the MIT Sloan School, and also Faculty Director of the MIT Executive MBA program, and a very active member of our faculty in the non-degree executive education program also. In this series, we introduce faculty who teach in our executive education programs and ask them to talk to us about some of the ideas that come out of their research and that they teach in programs here at MIT. And we mean these to be interactive. So I will hand over in a few moments to Professor Repenning, but please feel free to use the Q&A function that was just described to ask questions as they occur to you, and we will try to pause periodically to answer some of the questions that are coming up. So with that, it's my pleasure to hand over and welcome Professor Nelson Repenning.
Okay, Peter, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here. So what I thought I would do today is talk a little bit about a research question that has dominated essentially all of my professional life. And that research question actually has a very simple framing, which is when you look at the empirical evidence, it turns out that there's quite a paradoxical feature, you see, which is basically it boils down to there are more good tools and processes out there than there are organizations that actually use them. And if you live in the business school like I do, this is a little bit hard to understand because we tend to believe in a world where if someone discovers a new way of doing a core practice or process in their organization, we would expect that most of the industry would in fact eventually adopt that, and it wouldn't be a source of competitive advantage. That's true for some processes, practices, and technologies, but it turns out it's not true for a lot of other ones. And on the slide, you'll see that like most practicing managers, you're confronted with an ever-growing array of tools, practices, consultants, and you have to make some tough decisions about which of those things to use. And in fact, implementing them is a non-trivial task, can often be expensive. But the interesting finding, which we're going to talk about today, is it turns out in many cases, efforts to use those tools and practices do not produce the intended results. So what we're going to talk about a little bit today is why does that happen and what can you do about it? And in particular, as practitioners, you may not care about the scholarly version of that because this empirical finding challenges some of our most sort of closely held theories. But obviously there is a strong practical version of this problem, which is implementing a new tool or practice is expensive, requires a lot of your time and energy. So if you're going to do it, you want to do it in a way that has the best chance that you will you'll get the intended results out of that. And I won't go through all the data. There's a variety of studies that cover this, but let me just give you one example of what this literature tends to find. Several years ago, some colleagues at another university did a study of the entire Fortune 1000 to try to assess whether they had a well-developed quality management program. And they were studying the tools that are typically associated with TQM or Six Sigma or Lean. And just to put this in context, this was done approximately 30 years after the first books about quality management were written and popularized in the United States. So that information had been out there and available for plenty of time for people to adopt it. But in fact, they found that fewer than 10% of the Fortune 1000 had a well-developed quality management program and was using the tools effectively. And then in the second part of the study, they went to assess the financial performance of those firms that were using the quality tools and those that weren't. And they found something very interesting, which is it turned out that the companies that were using the quality-related tools did better. And they did better on just about any dimension that you cared to look at. They had better share prices, they had better earnings, they had happier employees, and so on. And so the basic paradox that we're going to talk about today is it turns out there are a set of practices out there that are available to you as practicing managers that if you use them effectively, they do work. They will make your company better, but in fact, most of you probably don't use them or you're not using them effectively. And so we want to talk about today a little bit about why that's the case, and more importantly, what can you do to put yourself in that exceptional category of the few firms that are able to basically continuously adopt new tools and practices, get benefit from them, and realize competitive advantage, rather than the other 90% that don't seem to be able to succeed in doing this kind of stuff. So that'll be the main topic for today. But before we get to that, let me just show you one more thing, which will just deepen the mystery I'm setting up a little bit more. I've studied this problem extensively with a variety of students, and the typical research design that we use is quite simple, which is after an organization has experienced a failed effort to incorporate a new piece of knowledge, a tool or practice or whatever, we will often go in and interview the folks who would have used that tool or practice to see why it didn't succeed. And the first question we always ask them is, how come you're not using the tool in question, whether it's the quality tools or a product development process or whatever. Now, if they answered that question by saying, well, we don't use the tool because it doesn't work, then this little mystery I'm setting up kind of disappears, and basically you just have a communication problem. But in fact, what we tend to find is something quite different, and it's captured in the first quote on the slide. One person we interviewed when we were studying a failed process improvement effort said, the new process is a good one. Someday I'd like to work on a project that actually uses it. And so this is a really interesting question, because now we have a situation where both the academics agree that there's a better way of doing things, and I just cited various studies, but even the people on the ground in this particular case agree that there was a better way to do this person's job. In this case, it was developing new products. But something about what was happening in the organization was conspiring to prevent this very well-intentioned person from using the best knowledge and practices that were available to him or her to get his or her job done. I got a variety of these. You can see more. The stuff isn't rocket science. I don't understand why we don't use it. Here's from another engineering organization. You should interview the engineering people. They'll tell you there's a procedure manual, but in many cases they don't even read it. Another one, clearly what we were doing didn't show up in the manual. We took a lot of shortcuts. And then, this last one is basically a variant of the first. The tenets of the new process are good. Using them is a different story. So in my research group, the way we tend to summarize this is that when it comes to new tools and processes in complex organizations, unfortunately, useful does not always imply used. And if you're like most of the managers we work with, if I were to go to your office or your cube, you probably have somewhere on a high shelf, far away, covered in dust, a set of 3-ring binders from the various change initiatives and implementation efforts you've been through, all of which actually probably contain some good stuff that did work at some point in your organization, but has never really been embedded so that it has fundamentally changed the way that you get your core work done. And as a consequence, probably some value is being left on the table because you're in the situation where you have a useful tool that's in fact not being used. So what we want to talk about today is why does that happen, and then what can we do about it. Just as one more piece of motivation, and then we'll move into the answer to that question, let me show you one more example. So for many years when I did this research, I worked with companies that were developing new products, that were in manufacturing, and I felt like if they could make some progress in terms of efficiency or productivity, we were helping them out. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to participate in an accident investigation for a major industrial accident, and it turns out this problem has a much more tragic consequence than at least I had appreciated. So, for example, this is not the accident that I worked on, but here's one that I read about. There was an explosion in 2008 in a sugar plant in Georgia. You can see the very unfortunate statistics here, 14 fatalities, 36 people injured, huge costs to the company in question. And the interesting and very sad finding when this accident was investigated is that the root cause was basically an accumulation of sugar dust. And if you look at the accident investigation report that came out of the Chemical Safety Board, the government body that investigates such things, you'll find out that this is a very acute and very sad version of the useful does not imply used phenomenon, because if you read through the bullets in the slide, what you'll see is that the practices required to prevent a sugar dust explosion both have been known for the better part of 100 years. You can see from the first bullet, since at least 1925, they were aware of the hazard, and they're very simple. It essentially boils down to good maintenance practices and housekeeping, And somehow what had happened in this particular facility is they had managed to depart from accepted practice, and in this case with very tragic consequences. And it turns out when you dig into other major industrial accidents, this finding is repeated over and over again, which is it's actually not often the exotic stuff that we don't understand that gets us in trouble. It's the failure to follow on a day-to-day basis basic, well-accepted practices that can get you in big trouble. So the question for today is, why does that happen? And to explain that, we're going to start with the notion of a capability. This is a word that we use around here a lot. It's a little bit of academic jargon, but all the notion of capability is trying to represent is just imagine for yourself what is a core feature or asset in your organization that is required to get whatever you do done on a regular basis. So for example, if you run a manufacturing process, one of your capabilities is probably just having well-maintained machines and well-calibrated equipment. If you're in an R&D organization, the critical capability probably resides largely in the heads of your engineers, which is the competence they have in designing effective new products. So just for the purpose of our ongoing discussion, probably most helpful for you to imagine a capability that is really central to the organization that you work in. And with that, our story about why useful does not always imply used starts with a very basic fact about capability, which is that it typically does not change right away. And the little picture I have on the slide is meant to depict that you should really think of capability as behaving like any other financial asset or any other accumulation of stuff that you might have in your organization. And specifically, if you want to grow your capability, you have to invest in it. And very importantly for this story, if you don't continue to maintain capabilities, it will tend with time to erode as people use equipment and so on. So to see a couple examples of the basic dynamics of capability, think about it this way. If you ran a manufacturing plant and you fired all of your maintenance mechanics, so they were no longer lubricating your equipment and calibrating it and so on, typically all your equipment would not break tomorrow, meaning that all the investments that you had made in maintenance up to that day would take some time and the equipment would have to be used before the capability would begin to erode. So even if you turned off that investment inflow, we didn't spend any money on maintenance, it would take time before that capability would consequently change. So capability doesn't change right away. And then on the flip side, if you decided you wanted to upgrade a key capability in your organization, so for example, you sent all your engineers to a new training course, so you bought them all new, faster computers, you would not typically get the benefits right away. It would take time between when you made those investments and you would realize the benefits of capability as they learn to use the new skills or you integrated the new computers with other activities in the R&D organization. So the important thing to take away here is simply that capability does not change right away, and actually that basic dynamic fact will help us go a long way towards explaining the useful does not imply used phenomenon. So with that distinction, now what I want to focus you on is that in any organization where capability matters, you face every day a basic trade-off, which is you can spend time doing actual work. So if you run a manufacturing organization, it could be making widgets. If you run an R&D organization, it could be doing new designs or creating new products. But any time that you spend doing actual work needs to be traded off against time and energy dedicated to devoting time and resources devoted to investing in capability. So a very simple example is manufacturing. I always face the trade-off between running a piece of equipment that makes widgets versus stopping that piece of equipment to do the maintenance or the calibration that would improve the subsequent productivity of the widget making process. Same story with R&D organizations. I can have my engineers work on new products, but I also might take the time to send them some training or to upgrade skills. And what the evidence suggests, particularly as we're talking about useful not implying used, is whereas everybody knows at a 50,000-foot level that you need to balance resources between those two things, in fact, what happens in most organizations is they end up devoting the vast majority of their time and energy to the work side, to production, and for some reason that we'll talk about in a moment, never quite seem to get around to making some of those investments in capability that would have improved productivity. So, for example, if you go back to the sugar plant explosion, it seems clear from the investigation report that they were spending a lot of time making sugar, not as much time with tragic consequence to the housekeeping and maintenance activities that would have prevented the sugar dust accumulation that led to the explosion. So the question we want to answer now is, why is it that even though we know that a stitch in time saves 9 and an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure and all sorts of other maxims and buzzwords, why is it that most organizations have such a hard time making the investments in capability that they all, at some degree, know are the right things to do? Well, we can explain that in 2 related ways. The first is we can appeal to some basic psychology, and it turns out that there are several biases. These are hardwired featured of human cognitive processes, how we make decisions, towards doing work. So, for example, it has been pretty clearly shown by psychologists that people tend to overweight salient and tangible features of their environment. That's all just a fancy academic way of saying that if we can see, touch, or taste something, it's much more likely to attract our attention than if we're dealing with something that is more ephemeral or might constitute an idea. So applying that basic finding to this trade-off between doing work and improving productivity, if I spend an extra hour today making widgets, that produces a very salient and tangible outcome. At the end of the hour, I can go count exactly how many widgets I produced or exactly how many lines of code my software engineers might have produced. In contrast, capability investments tend to have a much harder to characterize outcome. If I spend an hour going to training or an hour doing defect elimination, it's just much more difficult for our brains to figure out, well, exactly what have I produced in that particular case. So, as a consequence, back to the manufacturing example, if a plant manager or a shift manager has to make the trade-off between another hour making widgets and an hour spent on process improvement, his brain is very likely to push him towards the widget making because it's just a much more salient and tangible outcome. Similarly, people turn out to be risk and ambiguity averse. We like to work on things where we get an immediate outcome. And again, back to the same example from before, if I spend an hour producing widgets, I can very easily predict what I'm going to get for that hour. It tends not to be a pretty risky investment. In contrast, if I go to training or focus on defect elimination, I don't really know what I'm going to get for it at the outset, and that risk tends to make us psychologically uncomfortable. And then the third one, which will come back in the story a little bit later, is also there's a pretty clear bias towards the fact that we like to do things that have an immediate impact. Human beings like to feel like they are in control of their environments, and they like to do things that produce immediate outcomes. And back to the widgets again, if I spend an hour making widgets, I get those widgets right away. That's psychologically very satisfying. In contrast, if I spend an hour on training or defect elimination, I don't get the gains for a much longer period of time, and that's just a less comfortable environment for our brains. So the thing to take away from that is simply that if you are faced on a day-to-day basis with this trade-off between doing work and improving the productivity of the work process, the way that our underlying cognitive processes work will tend to bias us towards the work-related activities and away from some of the capability investment activities. It turns out the problem is a little bit worse than that for reasons that we'll come to in a moment, but this might be a good moment to take a quick pause if there are any questions before we move forward.
One question that perhaps been coming up a little bit, Nelson, thank you, is you've been talking mostly through the lens of manufacturing and sort of R&D. And the idea is that you're talking about here relevant in service industries too?
So there's no question. I tend to gravitate towards the manufacturing examples because I think they're a little easier to conjure in your head and see the trade-off. But in fact, these exact same dynamics show up in service operations as well. There's a paper that my colleagues wrote that takes this distinction to the service industry, which we'll reference near the end. But the basic trade-off you often find in the service environment that is very similar to the manufacturing environment is that when you are confronted with some kind of anomaly, a customer that's unhappy or doesn't like something, there are often things that you can do very quickly to get rid of that customer. You give them a bonus or you solve their problem and they'll run away. But often the sort of quick solution to the problem is more expensive for the company in question and may not resolve the underlying root cause. And in many cases, it would be better to spend more time with that customer, find out the true source of their problem so that you don't repeat it over and over again. Nonetheless, these same cognitive biases will push you towards, well, let's just pay them off or get them out of here, and off they'll go. One place that this has been applied are in service-related industries, where when you have a new customer, you have to do various pieces of vetting to figure out what kind of product you might sell them. So this might be insurance or giving a loan or something like that. And there have been several companies, some of which have been on the front pages of the newspaper, that got so focused on processing loans or insurance quickly that they didn't do as a good a job on the underlying vetting and got themselves in quite a bit of trouble a little bit later when it realized they had a book of business that they couldn't support, it wasn't profitable, or so on. So it's a great question. In fact, these same dynamics apply pretty squarely in that environment as well.
Another question that's come up as you were describing some of these biases. From your research, are there any differences between different cultures or people with different educational backgrounds in terms of these behaviors?
So it's a great question, and I sometimes joke that the type of things we do around here only work in organizations that have human beings in them, which turns out to be most of them, actually. But in fact, the evidence about differences in gender or education or culture is pretty limited, and I think in most cases the stuff that I'm talking about tends to be a pretty hardwired feature of how the human brain works, and so therefore is fairly robust across those differences. I'll talk about one phenomenon a little bit later in the talk called the fundamental attribution error, and it does appear in that case there might be some cross-cultural differences, although right now it seems to depend a little bit on which researcher does the study, so I'm not sure I have a lot of confidence in that finding. And I can explain why near the end, but basically it boils down to the human brain tends to be remarkably good at learning as long as there's a short time delay between action and outcome. And that just has to do with the structure of our cognitive processes. And that seems to be quite universal across, again, different genders and cultures and so on. But we'll come to that a little bit more at the end.
And perhaps one final question for the moment that might well be a good segue into your next section isn't what you're describing in many cases simply an issue of inadequate training when companies and organizations are rolling out new processes or initiatives?
So there's no question that often companies underinvest in a variety of different things that need to be in place for new practice to be successful, training being one of them. But what I'm trying to understand is why do we keep making that mistake over and over again? So on the one hand, you might do that early in your career, but it's such a robust and repeated phenomenon that there must be something deeper going on than, oh, geez, we just didn't write the check big enough for the training budget. But Peter's exactly right. That's an excellent segue to where we're going next. So it probably would make sense to move forward. So where we are in the story so far is that right now, the psychology would suggest that there is a static bias towards over-investing in work and not attending to capability investments enough. In fact, it turns out the problem is likely worse than that for a set of dynamic reasons that are captured or are begun to be captured on the next slide. So imagine the following setup. You leave the webinar today and you say to yourself, I don't think that MIT guy knows what he's talking about. The capability stuff is overrated. And in fact, I'm going to go back to my operation and I'm going to run an experiment. And specifically, the experiment is shown in the top graph on the slide, which imagine that you decided that you're actually going to reduce your investment in capability. That could be cutting training. It could be reducing your maintenance staff. It could be nothing more than going down to the plants tomorrow morning and pounding your fist on a workbench and saying, you got to get those widgets out the door. But basically, all those interventions would have the same effect, which is people will be spending more time working, making widgets, doing R&D or serving customers, and less time on improving the underlying productivity of the process. And the question is, having run that experiment, what feedback would you get from the environment that would tell you whether or not that was a good thing to do? Well, to answer that, we begin with capability. And remember, I started the story by saying the really critical point here is that capability tends not to change right away. So if you were to spend less time improving and more time working, your capability would decline, but it wouldn't decline right away because you would essentially be leveraging all the investments in capability you had made up until the point you had made that particular decision. So, for example, if you were to cut your maintenance staff in half, you would eventually experience more outages and more breakages and more quality problems, but it would take some time and some use of the equipment before that would break in. That would manifest. Similarly, if you quit training your engineers, it would take some time before their skills were outdated with their new technology and so on. So given that we're spending more time working, less time improving, and capability declines but only slowly, what happens to the performance of your facility, whatever it is? And that's shown in the final graph, which is, if you think about it for a moment, you'll probably see that if you spend more time working and less time improving, because capability does not change right away, what's going to happen is, having made that decision, your performance is actually going to get better before it gets worse. And the reason we call this better before worse behavior. And the reason for better before worse is simply because capability doesn't change right away. If you decide to spend more time on work, you will essentially be able to harvest your past investments in capability to create a short-term gain. Now, once you understand the basic dynamics, we can now connect it to the psychology again, and it turns out that human beings actually have a very difficult time making better before worse trade-offs in the right direction. And therefore, it is very likely that people will make this decision, even though it might not be in the long-run interest of the organization. And to see why we struggle with making this kind of trade-off in the right direction, we start with the basic fact about human learning, which I alluded to earlier, which is, if you study how humans learn, we tend to be very effective learners when there's a short time delay between taking an action and getting an outcome. And the example I always use is, at some point when you were a kid, you probably accidentally touched something hot like a stove or a radiator, and you learned really quickly to quit touching hot stoves, right? You probably only had to run that experiment once. That's a situation where humans learn very effectively, because the moment you take the action, in this case touching the stove or the radiator, you get immediate feedback that that was a bad thing to do. In contrast, when there's a long time delay between action and outcome, it's much less likely that we will ever learn that those two things are connected. And my favorite example here, as a recent parent of young children, they're getting to be teenagers now, is getting your kids to eat their vegetables. Okay? Particularly my son, really like me, actually, as it turns out, does not like broccoli, and so getting him to eat broccoli was an ongoing challenge. So why is that? Well, what's the value proposition for broccoli? Right? As you all know, that living a healthy life and eating your vegetables is supposed to be good for you, and as you get a little bit older, if you eat your vegetables, you will tend to be healthier and less likely to get a variety of afflictions that broccoli has been shown to prevent. Okay? So you might think, well, since broccoli and other vegetables are so good for you, that kids would immediately learn that that's a good thing to do, and it wouldn't be such a headache or a hassle to get them to do that. But it turns out the human brain doesn't work that way. So my son was 10 years old. The payoff for eating his broccoli is probably not going to be realized for 30 or 40 years. Okay? It is very unlikely that he will ever learn that those two things are connected, because there's such a long delay between action and outcome, and our brains just don't work that way. And in fact, the broccoli case is even a little bit more interesting, and it connects to some of the safety challenges that I alluded to earlier. Because if you think about it, if you eat your vegetables, go to the gym, don't drink and smoke too much, and so on, what happens as you get older? Well, it's kind of a trick question, because what you hope happens is nothing. You don't get sick, you don't have any heart-related issues, and so on, and you live a long and happy life, which is, of course, what we all aspire to. But in fact, that's a very difficult situation, probably the most difficult situation for humans to learn the right lessons in, because we take an action and the outcome is nothing. Our brains are actually not good with that. It's in some sense the exact opposite of the hot stove case, where you make a big investment, but it produces no feedback from the environment about whether or not that was a good thing to do. This turns out, just as an aside, one of the reasons that maintaining a good safety culture in a high-hazard industry is so difficult, because if you think about it for a moment, a safety program is exactly like broccoli. It's difficult, it takes time, it requires a lot of time and energy that could be dedicated to production, and if you do it exactly right, what happens? The answer turns out to be exactly what you want, which is exactly nothing. You have no accidents, no incidents, recordables, and so on. But again, our brains are not good with that. It's less likely that we'll learn that those two things are connected, and therefore it's very likely that the temptation to skimp on safety investments will be almost overwhelming, because you're not getting that satisfying connection between taking an action and getting an outcome. So with that aside about learning, we come back to the better before worse behavior, and here the situation is a little bit more complicated, because actually two things happen. If we skimp on capability and focus on work, initially things get better, but over time things get worse. And actually, once you mesh this against what I just told you about learning, you can see that it's actually very easy for managers to learn exactly the wrong lesson in this system. So take the following situation. Imagine Peter here is a plant manager, and he's having a tough day, and in particular, it's Wednesday morning, and he just got a call from a very important customer that says that you don't get a shipment out of Peter's plant this week, that they're going to cancel the business because they actually need this product, whatever it might be. So Peter walks down to the plant on Wednesday morning, pounds his fist. Peter would never do this. I'm just using the hypothetical. Pounds his fist on the table and says, "We've got to get those widgets out the door by Friday, or something bad is going to happen." So what everybody does, of course, is they put aside whatever else they're doing, whether it could be capability investments or maintenance, and they work on making the widgets. And so Friday afternoon, the widgets go out the door. Okay? Well, what does Peter learn from that? Well, learning from the better part of the worse before better trade-off is very easy. He pounded his fist on the table on Wednesday, and by Friday afternoon, the shipments go out the door. So his brain, just like any other manager's brain, is going to be very easily connect that action to the outcome, which is I yelled at everybody and things got better. Okay? What's missing now is it will be much more difficult for Peter or any other manager to see what were all the capability investments that were skipped or skimped upon between Wednesday and Friday when everybody was focusing on the widget. Okay? So he doesn't really know what's happening. Moreover, the cost of that decision, which might accrue from lack of maintenance or lack of training, will only show up days or weeks or months later, right? And it's much less likely that Peter will ever see the full consequence of his decision. So if you think about the better for worse behavior, the unfortunate feature of it is it's very easy to learn from the good part. I yelled at people or I cut capability and the widgets went out the door, but it's much less likely people will ever learn to connect that same decision with the bad part, which is performance in the long run will actually decline. And here's sort of the definitive piece of evidence for that. You can chime in on this one on the Q&A. But how many of you have ever been in a meeting where you're dealing with some big screw-up in the organization? It could be a late product or an unhappy customer. And the senior person in the room will raise his or her hand and say, the reason we're in this mess is because of a decision I made 2 years ago. Okay? That tends not to happen, and it's not anybody's fault. Our brains just don't work that way. We are not very good, particularly at connecting action to outcome. So the first takeaway from this, and we call this set of dynamics here the capability trap, is simply if you live and work in this system, if you don't have a deep understanding of the underlying dynamics of capability, it is actually quite easy to learn exactly the wrong lesson as to what are the underlying sources of performance because of this match between the system and how humans learn. Every time you yell at someone or skimp on capability, things get better right away. Very easy to learn the wrong lesson. Now, in fact, once we put that dynamic into a larger organization, the challenges of learning actually even go up. And the way to see that is imagine here at the peak of the better part of the worse before better. Imagine this is Peter again, just because he's sitting next to me and I can use him as an example. In most organizations, imagine he's a plant manager or running an R&D organization, right about the part where I've drawn that vertical line, what is likely to happen to Peter? Well, at least in most of the organizations that I have studied and worked in, if you have a high flyer that's producing above average performance, you want to reward that performance. So we get a big bonus and so on, but pretty quickly what's going to happen is we're going to promote it. And so Peter is going to move on to a big job somewhere else. Maybe he's in the corporate office or so on. But once he gets promoted, meaning he's out of that plant or R&D organization, now the chance that he's going to learn to connect his action to their full consequences of the outcomes is basically nil. He's not going to be there. He's not going to be available. And so he's probably very unlikely to learn the right lesson. And so now someone else takes his job because he's gotten promoted. And just to kind of continue this story a little bit, imagine we have the first performance review for our new plant manager at the second vertical line I've drawn there, right? And if I'm the boss, I bring that person into my office and I say, well, you're a very nice person, but geez, since I had Peter moved on and you've taken over the job, things have actually gotten worse, right? So what's that person going to do? Well, in my experience at least, the informal network in organizations works very rapidly and information is transferred very efficiently. So it's very likely that that person's going to figure out that his or her predecessor got where he or she was by skimping on capability and focusing on work. And so what we have observed in many of the companies that we've studied is that each plant manager or R&D manager or service manager runs the same experiment over and over again, each one skimping a little bit more on capability and focusing a little bit more on performance. And so the trajectory of performance that you're likely to see, if I can draw it here, is going to look like this. And then we're going to get another one here when it refreshes. And things are going to get sort of worse and worse and worse. And I've worked with several organizations that have been through that cycle 4 or 5 times, each person focusing a little bit more on work and a little bit less on capability, until capability has been allowed to erode to such a low level that people have to spend all their time, day in and day out, getting their work done. They never have time to invest in capabilities, and they're very surprised that their other competitors are moving past them very rapidly. And in the high-hazard world, if you live in that cycle long enough, something like that imperial sugar explosion is bound to happen sooner or later. Something really bad is going to occur. So this is kind of the core story of why it's at least half the story of why new innovations so often go unused, which is if you don't understand the dynamics of capability development, it's quite easy to learn the wrong lesson and find yourself trapped at such a low level of performance that you never really have the time or space to make the investments that would get you out of the trap in the first place. So that's probably a good place to stop again and maybe take a question or two before we move forward.
Yes, thanks, Nelson. So a couple of many questions that we're getting. There's one cluster that the questions around to what extent is this really all driven by something which is inevitable and inescapable, which is the business pressure that everybody is under, with emphasis on quarterly performance and results. Isn't that just really what's driving these behaviors?
So that's a great question, and it not surprisingly comes up often. And when I give this for audiences, very often what will happen is someone will raise his or her hand and say, I understand this problem. It's actually my boss that doesn't understand it, right? So responsibility is bounced up a level. And then occasionally the boss is in the room, and then he or she will raise his or her hand and say, oh, no, I understand this too. It's actually my boss is the problem. And pretty soon it gets bounced all the way up that all the world's problems are caused by stock analysts that don't really understand what's going on. I actually think that kind of finger-pointing misses the mark a little bit. And I think that for 2 reasons, which is, number one, I don't have a lot of evidence that actually many people understand this. It's quite contrary to the way some of the underlying psychology works. But also, if you look at the exceptional organizations that we read about in the business press, the mighty Toyota or Alcoa or Southwest or so on, you can think of lots of others, they appear, and this is mostly just my inference at this juncture, to have a much better handle on this. And in fact, their investors love them. So I think the short-term pressure that people talk about is a little bit of a cop-out in terms of not making some of the difficult decisions to get out of the trap. Now, that said, the last thing I'm going to talk about before we wrap up is it turns out that once people recognize that they're in the capability trap, often the strategies that they use to get themselves out of it actually dramatically reduce their chances of success. So I will address that a little bit at the end. But I think the focus on short-term pressure, it's certainly there. It's certainly a reality that all managers face. But I think also it's probably a little bit too convenient to point to everybody else because I think it's actually a much more deeply seated feature of how humans make decisions that require some discipline on the part of leadership. And just as an example, one of the things that's interesting about this, and I can give you some of the psychological underpinnings a little bit later if you're interested, is organizations are actually very comfortable with making these kinds of investments in other domains all the time. Right? When you start a new R&D project, you're going to spend billions of dollars potentially before you get the returns, and we know that there's a delay between action and outcome. But it's not been unusual in my career to sit in a meeting, watch a manager approve a big investment that has a long payoff, walk out the door, and yell at somebody because they were spending too much time on capability. And so there is a little bit of a kind of paradox there or some inconsistent behavior on the part of people that make these decisions. But I'll have more to say about that one in a moment. come to that a little later.
Just actually a follow-up on that point. In your research, do you see a difference between publicly traded and privately owned companies and answers to these questions?
So that's a great question. Sometimes when I say that in class as well, people from privately owned companies, will raise their hand and say, you've never worked for a single family. They can be just as tough as public investors. In fact, there is limited investment, limited data, and there's only a study or two that does suggest that privately owned firms actually might be in a better position to make some of these investments than publicly traded. And again, just as a sort of observation on my part, I think the huge rise in the last decade of private equity as another sort of intervention and funding model might be in part driven by this, that firms that take companies private and have some extra capital might be leveraging the fact that there's a lot of value generation potential that's not being realized by public traded companies. But I think, at least to my knowledge, there's not a real credible large sample study that would speak that. That's just an instinct that I have.
Okay, so I think speaking from many of the questions that we're also getting in, you've convinced us of the nature of the problem.
What do we do about it?
Hopefully you're going to help us understand what the solution might be.
Yes. All right. So why don't we move forward? So let me show you just a couple examples of this really quickly, and then we'll talk about the solution. So here is some data from one of the studies we've done just to show you what a real version of the capability trap looks like. This is from a software project that one of my students studied, and what's being depicted in the graph is the number of lines of code. The scale has been disguised, so don't read anything into the actual numbers. Number of lines of code that a software development team produced. The team size has been adjusted for team size, so it's essentially constant. And what you can see is for several years, each year their productivity got better and better and better, and then at about year 3 peaked. They were the coolest kids on the block at this company. They were producing lots and lots of code. It was a very hot product. And then you can see this huge crash after that. And what the analysis identified ex post is where were the productivity improvements coming from? Well, the team was staying late, working really, really hard, weekends and so on. But also, they were starting to skimp under production pressure on a lot of the elements of good software engineering practice. So they were less attentive to the architecture. They were less attentive to documentation. They were less attentive to testing. And what eventually happened is they got a whole host of a lot of product out in the field that was pretty buggy, and that ended up distracting the software engineers as they had to go out in the field and fix this stuff and do lots of patching. And you can see it had a very negative effect on their productivity. So one of the punchlines of all this, which I'll repeat near the end, if you are imagine you're a manager in year 2 or 3 here, when someone comes into your office is talking about all the great stuff they're doing and the good results you're getting, the question you want to ask them, if you're worried about the capability trap, is how are they getting them? And basically, are they getting better results for the right reasons? They're doing learning, they're doing root cause analysis, or are they getting them because they're skimping on some of the investments that are going to come back to get them in trouble a little bit later? Here's another. This quote is just an example of what the capability trap looks like in manufacturing. This is an organization where the capability of the equipment had gotten so low that they never had time to do the preventive maintenance or root cause analysis because they were always behind on their targets. But the fact that they weren't doing any kind of maintenance made the line unstable, and you get this kind of snowball effect. And then here's one last example. This was from an organization I studied that was trying to improve the efficiency of their engineering process. And the way that they were going to do it is they asked their engineers, and anytime they did a new piece of work, they were supposed to take that piece of work and put it on this electronic library called the bookshelf. And the idea was that if it was on the bookshelf, next time I need to do that piece of work, I wouldn't have to do it all again. They spent a lot of money getting the software right and so on, but in fact, they never got a single design on the bookshelf. And the reason was simply that the engineers were so under the gun to get their real work done, they could never carve out the time to actually do the documentation that would have produced the bookshelf, and they never got any benefits from it. So just an example of a good practice that didn't succeed because they didn't have the time to invest in capability. Now, I know we're running low on time, so we'll get to the final piece. So let's imagine now, if I can get the slides to come up here, that you run the opposite experiment, which is you decide, these aren't to scale particularly, but you decide to spend more time improving, more time investing in capability, and less time on work. That is, you adopt a new tool or practice or whatever. What are the dynamic consequences of that? And you can see in the graph that it's basically the flip side of the example I showed you before. If you spend more time on improving in capability investments, capability will improve, But just like capability doesn't decline right away, it also tends not to go up right away. And so as a consequence, the other reason that useful often doesn't imply used is that when you do something new, typically performance is going to get worse before it gets better. And that's the graph on the far right there. And that actually is probably creates the most common failure mode in the change initiatives we've studied, and it has two flavors. Flavor number one is if you don't understand the dynamics, you might erroneously believe that if you invest in a new practice or technology, things are going to get better right away. So the way I sometimes think about this, imagine a consultant is in your office trying to sell you a new technique. What picture would they draw on your whiteboard about the benefits that you're going to get from it? And I would argue that they're tend to draw something like this, right? Things are just going to get better right away. But in fact, if the true state of the world is the worse before better, and you believe the picture that the consultant or someone else drew for you, what tends to happen at that vertical line that I just drew? Well, in most cases, people will abandon the new technology because they believe it doesn't work, right? You told me that, N sigma was going to make things better. In fact, when I tried it, my performance initially went down. So that's failure mode number one. And lesson number one is simply, if you're going to try to do something new, use a new tool or new practice, be prepared to accept the worst part before you get the better, because that's just a sort of fundamental feature of what happens when you build capability. The second failure mode, though, which I think is far more important, is typically it's often hard to sell organizations on doing new things. We want to focus on making widgets or whatever. But the interesting sort of pathology there is that once an organization is sold on doing something new, they tend to want to fix everything at once. Okay? So imagine that you identify low capability as a significant problem. At least in the organizations I've studied, the tendency to want to fix every capability gap immediately is almost overwhelming. The problem with that, though, is that if you try to change everything at once, how does it change the shape of the worse before better curve that's depicted in my little graph? And I would argue it typically will look like this, which is the more we try to change, the deeper the dip will be before you get the benefit. So, for example, earlier in my career, I studied several companies that were trying to change their product development processes to make them better, and they very often wanted to fix a whole bunch of things at once. They would get new computers, they would have new process steps, they would use new suppliers. The problem with that model, though, is that if you try to change everything at once, the size of the worst part before you get the better is typically much bigger than most organizations simply have the stomach for. And if you want a simple analogy, right, it's one thing to get a new piece of software on your computer, and typically your productivity will fall before you get some of the gains. Contrast that with changing your entire operating system, right? Then the cost is going to be much more significant before you get the benefits. So the second big lesson here is, lesson number one is simply, if you're going to make a change, be prepared for the worst before better part. But the second big lesson is don't let your change strategy of trying to do too many things at once, sow the seeds of a failed initiative of something that might otherwise produce big gains. It typically is going to be much more successful to, if possible, try to break the change effort up into smaller incremental pieces and get through the worst part of piece one and get some of the benefits before you then move on to piece two. And in fact, at least the organizations that we study that do this well, rather than thinking of change as this kind of painfully episodic phenomenon where every 2 years we do some big initiative or organizational change, try to make change as just a small part of their business that happens every day so that there's an ongoing trajectory of learning or improvement. So my second big piece of advice to help beat these dynamics is think about making small gains in capability every day as part of the way you do the work, rather than something you do every year or two in the context of some really massive reorganization. Because I think the worse before better that you get is simply inconsistent with the appetite that most organizations have. All right, I think we're almost out of time, so I probably should stop there. I imagine we have a few more questions.
So just following up, Nelson, on that, as you were talking about the question about breaking things up into smaller pieces, a few people were asking about examples where it's really tough to see how you would do that, like a major software enterprise resource planning implementation in your company. We won't mention any names, but some were.
Right.
What do you do in that situation?
So it's a great question, and I think there are cases where you're thinking about a major capability upgrade that do not lend itself to the kind of small is small is beautiful or creeping incrementalism strategy that I'm recommending. And IT implementations are often a great example. In some cases, you either got to kind of go big or go home in that particular case. And I think, the advice I have in that case is if the change or the capability does not lend itself to breaking it into bite-sized pieces, you just need to be prepared for what you're getting into. And there's plenty of data out there from benchmarking organizations about how long it's going to take and how long the worst is going to be. And if you plan for that and are ready to accept it, you're much more likely to succeed. The biggest failure mode by far is we're trying to do something new and we know we have costs, but rather than embed that in resource plans and performance plans, organizations just assume that they're going to somehow figure it out. We're just going to squeeze. We're smart people, we'll make it work, and that is a recipe for a failed initiative. We've studied a couple where they tried to make major software upgrades, and what you ended up seeing is people would have the brand new computer on their desk covered with Post-its and dust. It was basically the world's most expensive paperweight because people had never had the time to adapt to the new system and had found lots of ways of working around. So when you can't break it up, be honest with yourselves about how long it's going to take and embed the worst part into the various plans and resourcing strategies, and you're much more likely to succeed.
Great. So many people have heard you use the term fundamental attribution error. I think you mentioned it earlier also. What's the role of the fundamental attribution error in this challenge, and how does it help with the solution?
So that's a great question. So the fundamental attribution error is a finding from psychology, which is that it turns out that human beings have a hardwired propensity to blame other people, for the source of problems rather than the structure of the system or the context in which they find themselves. So one of the examples you see in the news all the time is that when a professional sports team is not playing well, the first thing that we do is we fire the coach, right? It has nothing to do with the fact that the sports team is in a small city and they don't have the same revenue as the big city teams or something like that. It must be the coach's fault. And how this connects to the capability trap is that very often one of the things we see is that senior managers and people that work for them, or folks that are on the shop floor or the R&D floor, can often get into very antagonistic relationships. And it turns out that at least one of the reasons for that is that if you go back to the better before worse behavior, right, if I am prone to the fundamental attribution error and I think that the people that work in my plant might not be working hard enough, right, one way I might test my sneaking suspicion is I might, again, bang my fist on the table or give them a stretch objective or something like that, because I secretly believe that there's a little slack out there. And the problem, of course, is because of the capability trap, if I bang my fist on the table or increase their targets, they are very likely to skimp a little bit more on capability and spend more time on work, producing a short-term increase in production. The problem, though, is that can potentially confirm my initially erroneous attribution. So my colleague John Sterman and I coined this phrase, the self-confirming attribution error, which basically says if you kind of combine the fundamental attribution error and the capability trap, you get a really pathological situation where I may walk in believing that the folks in my factory aren't working hard enough, but I take action that actually cause that mental model to come true, even if it wasn't initially the case. In other words, I put more pressure on them, they get into the capability trap, which produces a short-term gain, and then it confirms, in fact, that yes, they were a bunch of slackers, and I should probably even ratchet up the pressure a little bit more, and that can take an organization to a very, very bad place. And so I think I have a slide here a little bit farther, if I could find it, to show you just one quick example of what those dynamics look like. So here's the layout of the self-confirming attribution error. This is the situation that I just described, but I think the example. So here's an example. One of the companies I studied had a real antagonistic relationship between the senior managers and their R&D engineers. So if you went and interviewed the managers and said, well, how come you're not getting your work done, they blamed everything on the engineers. They don't want to follow the process. They're Wild West. They don't like the bureaucracy. But when you went to talk to the engineers, they didn't say that they didn't want to follow the process. In fact, these are the same ones that said, I'd love to follow the process someday. What they complained about is they had such a high degree of workload that they didn't have time to both do their work and follow the process. Now, in fact, neither of these explanations is exactly right. What's being missed there is they've gotten into a real pathological situation where the objectives are going up, the engineers are skimping on the underlying process to try and meet those objectives, but it has the very unfortunate consequence of just further confirming the otherwise initially erroneous mental model that the managers start out with.
Great, thank you. So perhaps to begin to wrap up here and to maybe throw a bit of a challenge to you, Nelson. So to take on the spirit that you're suggesting here of continuous improvement and not biting off too much in a project, what actually can we all do when we get off this webinar now, or maybe come into the office tomorrow morning to actually help us address the situation?
So, great question, and I would leave you with a couple thoughts. I think the answer starts with actually where we started the talk, which is, the first thing you might do when you walk off is just grab a pen or pencil and think about what are the 3 or 4 capabilities that are absolutely central to the success of your organization. One of the things that I'm always a little surprised with is that the capability development maintenance strategy in a lot of organizations is a little bit diffuse, and they're spending money investing on some stuff that's really important and other things that are nice to have but maybe not so central to the to what they really get done. So part one, I think, is just be really clear on what is the process in your organization that generates value and what are the capabilities that you really need to maintain that. I think part two is just being clear on, given those 3 or 4 capabilities, what do you need to do to maintain and improve them. And here I actually have a piece of advice that will seem odd, but I have actually come to believe that probably the best thing you can do is simply fix the amount of time and resources you're going to dedicate to those capabilities. Some of the organizations that I've worked with, for example, have just made a somewhat arbitrary claim that we're going to spend 4 hours a week working on process improvement. Now, you might say, well, why would you want to fix it? Isn't there benefit from flexibility? Because some weeks it might be better to do 4 and some weeks it might be better to do 6. And I would agree with that, except that remember, you're fighting the psychology. Because of the capability trap, the seduction of skimping on capability and focusing on work is going to be so strong that I actually think there's a huge benefit to just fixing that decision once and for all. Make it 5% of your time or 10% or whatever it is, and then adhering to that. And then the last thing I would recommend, and this is probably the most important, and I think I alluded to this before, but anytime you're getting above average results in your organization, I think the question that every senior leader needs to ask him or herself is, are we getting these for the right reasons or the wrong reasons? And again, the right reasons are because we've improved capability, we've made the right investments, we've essentially acted smarter than our competitors, and the wrong reasons are we're not following the process, we're not documenting our code, we're working a gazillion extra hours, because even though you might really like those results, right, if you're getting them for the wrong reasons, chances are it's going to come back to bite you in ways that you're not going to like.
Thank you, Nelson. Well, we're just about out of time, and this is a really fascinating subject. And I know that many people will be interested to learn more about this. So we have in the slide deck, I think, some further reading. And also, I think on the slide that's showing just now, some of the programs here at MIT Sloan that Nelson teaches in. And Nelson's also very generously agreed to stick around with us for a while longer after the end of the broadcast webinar, and we'll be hosting questions and answers via LinkedIn, and we're just pushing the link to that for you now. So for this section, thank you very much, Nelson, and for those of you who may have to get back to solving your own capability trap challenges, thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again at one of our future webinars. And all of those of you who are able to stay on and move over to LinkedIn and keep asking us questions, we'll look forward to seeing you on LinkedIn in maybe the next 20 or 30 seconds. So with that, Professor Nelson Repenning, thank you very much indeed, and we'll see many of you in a few seconds.
And thank you again to all our participants for joining us today. We hope you found this webcast presentation informative. This does conclude our webcast, and you may now disconnect. Have a good day.